So this is the very last topic of National 5 Biology, and this is 3.6 Evolution of Species. So to begin with, you need to be able to explain what a mutation is. And there are various factors which can increase the rate of mutation. And then mutations then kind of lead us into the process of natural selection, and natural selection So from Unit 1, when we did DNA, you might remember what a mutation is, and it's just something random, and it's the change in the order of the DNA. A, T, G, C are the bases, and it's spontaneous, and it's the only source of new something in a population. So this is a term you should know. So if you consider eye color, you would have the brown something, the blue something, the green something allele. So the only source of new alleles in a population. So here is a mutation. So in this mutation, 3 base pairs have been lost. There's different types of mutation. We go into more detail on them in higher biology, but for our purposes just now, if you just think about a mutation being a change in the order of the DNA bases, whether it's something being added, something being substituted, something being deleted, all you need to think about is it's a change. So going back, just to remind you of what happens here, so you've got your DNA, and remember it gets converted into mRNA, and mRNA then goes to the ribosome and that's where proteins are made. So if the DNA is altered, if it's mutated, then there's going to be a knock-on effect, and that the mRNA is going to be altered, as you can see down here, and then as a result of that, protein is going to be altered as well. So that small change in those letters can change the structure and function of proteins, which can be significant. And sometimes they can be advantageous. They might increase the chance of the organism surviving and reproducing. If you look at COVID-19 at the moment, we talk about variants of the virus, and that is a mutation. And if you've got a variant that is going to make the virus more transmissible, then that would increase the chance of it surviving and reproducing. So eventually it would become the dominant. So that would be an advantageous mutation from the point of view of the virus. So an example could be if you have improved eyesight in an owl, just through a random mutation, the owl is able to see better. It can get its prey more easily, so that would be an advantage. A disadvantage, if you've got, say, a rabbit that has got less developed leg muscles, would make it more difficult for it to run away from a fox, for example. So that would be a decreased chance of surviving and reproducing. Whereas some of us have got our earlobes attached to the side of our jaw, some don't. That's not going to affect whether you're going to live or not. So that would be what's called a neutral mutation. You might know this is already. So different things which can cause mutations. So it can be environmental factors. So UV radiation, and you'll know this in terms of the reason why we put sun cream on to try and avoid skin cancer. So radiation can cause mutations, and certainly around places where there's been, or Chernobyl, where there's a nuclear accident, there's mutations have occurred within some of the plant life, and I guess there will have been amongst larger organisms as well, but that's something that's being studied. And also certain chemicals can cause mutations too. So it does happen. It happens randomly in all of us, but there are these environmental factors which can increase the rate of mutations. So just to kind of give you some examples, here you have a couple, and one of them has got pale skin and one of them has got darker skin. And the reason, this is Robert De Niro on the left, the reason why Robert De Niro has got lighter skin is because a mutation occurred thousands of years ago, originally all humans had darker skin. We originated in Africa, and there was a mutation which meant that people ended up having lighter skin. And the benefit of this was it meant that they could absorb more vitamin D as they moved out of Africa into places where there was less sunlight. So that's a mutation that was advantageous for those people, living at that time who came out of Africa into and started living in different climates. Okay, and this is a nice video, so have a look at this. So science of skin colour, and it will just kind of talk you through, kind of go into a bit more detail what I kind of alluded to there. Another one, so this is an albino squirrel. So if you have this mutation, is one where happens in humans as well and various different organisms. But basically, the mutation means very very small change in DNA, but it means that the organism is unable to produce melanin. And also another effect of the mutation is you end up with poorer eyesight. So albino squirrels don't survive very well in the wild, I wouldn't imagine. This one here, so this is an interesting one going back in human history. So humans domesticated cattle a few thousand years ago, and we use them for meat, and they were used for pulling carts and things. But also, some people had a mutation which meant that they were able to drink cow's milk. Yeah, and this is called lactose tolerance. So still a lot of people around the world who are lactose intolerant, but there was a mutation in some people which meant that they could digest lactose, which is the sugar in milk, properly. And obviously, if times are tough, then that is going to lead to an increased chance of you surviving. And now I think probably most of us in the Western world anyway have milk every day pretty much, but not quite so common in other areas of the world where people don't have that mutation. Here's another one. So blue eyes. So people originally had brown eyes, and I think they've actually traced back the first person with blue eyes. I think it was in Turkey a few thousand years ago, and everyone with blue eyes, that is their ancestor. Why it spread, I think the kind of consensus, or maybe it's not consensus, but certainly the speculation is it's maybe was seen as attractive, so that person produced more offspring, and then as a result of that, it spread around the world. So those are mutations. The next uh, part is to go into natural selection, and this is a good video to have a look at. So search for this, what is natural selection, and watch that. It should be the top result on YouTube. So what mutations do is they lead to variation. So mutations are inherited by offspring. So if you have that very first person with blue eyes, if they, when you know this from doing in Unit 2 variation and inheritance, your homozygous, heterozygous, and your monohybrid crosses and so on. If your genetics are passed on to your offspring, and so mutations as well are inherited by offspring, and they mean that you have genetic variation. And if you've got variation, then it means that the population is able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So the polar bear example here, you have got polar bears who had, these two bears had a common ancestor. This one ended up in a kind of climate further north, and then they had various mutations. One of them which meant that they didn't produce, they don't have brown fur, which meant that offered them camouflage. Various other mutations which helped keep them warm, and that allowed them to survive in that different environment. So natural selection then is the process by which a population evolves over time in response to changing environmental conditions. So all of these finches here, they at one point in time had a common ancestor. And the reason we've got finches is because Charles Darwin, who came up with a lot of the original kind of groundwork on evolution and natural selection. This is one of the organisms that he studied. So you had a common ancestor of all these finches, and independent on what environment they were in and what food was available, they evolved in different ways. Okay, random mutations, but then some of them helped the organism survive. So over time, you end up with finches that look different. So it's quite, I think a good way to kind of remember this is to break it down into stages. So the first stage of natural selection is, first of all, you have your mutations. So they, as I said, they happen randomly, or they could be caused by radiation or chemicals. But these mutations create variation within the population, so you end up with members of that population looking a bit different from each other. Then you have species producing lots of offspring. So, you know, we're going to look at an example of rabbits, but say rabbits produce 10 offspring, and there's only enough resources in the environment to sustain maybe 6 of them. Then 4 of them are going to die due to what's called selection pressures. So there's a lack of food, for example, and it means that only you know, they're not going to survive, whereas the ones who have got advantageous mutations will survive. So that's number 3. So the individuals that are best adapted to their environment, they have an advantage, so they survive to reproduce, and that is where the phrase survival of the fittest occurs, where it comes from. And then finally, those genes, or the favourable alleles, which gave those individuals, the fittest individuals, the advantage, they are then passed on to the offspring, and you're going to have a population which is, you know, well adapted to the environment. So that's natural selection. So first of all, mutation creates variation. Those who have got unfavourable mutations, they will die. Those whose mutations give them an advantage to survive, so it could be speed, it could be camouflage, they survive, they pass on the genes which gave them that advantage to their offspring, and then it just repeats, and over generations you end up with populations of animals and plants who are well adapted to their environment. So try this. That's just a wee summary of that. So press pause, put down numbers 1 to 8 and see if you can do that. So number 1, mutations create 2 variation in a population of animals. The animals produce more offspring than the 3 environment can sustain. Some individuals die due to 4 is selection pressures, e.g. lack of food. The best 5 is adapted to their environment, have an advantage, so survive to number 6 is reproduce. The number 7, the genes, which gave the fittest individuals the 8 is selective advantage, are passed on to their offspring, and the process starts again. And just to exemplify the process, here we have rabbits. So the rabbits have bred like rabbits, and they have produced there's lots of variation within their offspring. You have the ones who are less well adapted. They have maybe had disadvantageous mutations. They die, for example, because they're slow. The best adapted, the ones with the most favourable mutations, survive and they breed, and then again more offspring are produced, and it just repeats, so on, generation after generation, and then you have the rabbits best adapted to their environment surviving. Another example here is the peppered moth. So this is related to environmental changes in England in Victorian times. So you had around factories, before the factories were constructed, this light-coloured peppered moth benefited because birds couldn't see it because it was camouflaged against the trees, whereas the darker one, the birds were able to see it. Then, because of pollution, it switched. So suddenly, if you had darker colouring, then that was an advantage. So these ones increased in number because it gave them an advantage. Another example here, so here we have got bacteria, so each one of these circles is normal bacteria, and you have got suddenly one, because of a random mutation, has become resistant to antibiotics, so antibiotics kill bacteria. Then what that means is when the antibiotic is next introduced, you will have these ones survive. Then over time, what that means is these ones are the best adapted as opposed to their environment, so they become the dominant strain, and this is an increasing problem with antibiotics that we have. Increasingly, there's strains of bacteria which are resistant to antibiotics. So just to finish off this session, there's a couple of wee games you can have a look at. We'll do them in class when we're back, hopefully. But if you have a look for these, it's a sort of Charles Darwin survival game, and you have to kind of cause mutations and look at variation and see if you can get a population of living things to live for 1,000,000 years. So you can have a go at that. So each of those links should work. So second session on this, so we did natural selection last time. So to begin with, let's just do a couple of starters just to see if you can remember. So press pause and answer those questions. So number one, a mutation or mutations are random changes in the order of DNA bases. The potential effect of mutations on proteins, so they can alter the structure and consequently the function of a protein. And then three, name two mutagenic agents, or in simpler terms, name two things which can cause mutations, and they are ultraviolet radiation, you could just say radiation, and chemicals. Second part, try this. So describe the 4 stages of natural selection. The words below should be included in each description. So press pause and see if you can come up with that. This is the equivalent of what could be a 4-mark question in an exam paper. So the stages of natural selection. So you should have number 1, mutations create variation in a population. And remember, a population is all the living things of one species in an area. 2, species produce more offspring than the environment can sustain, and then as a result of that, you've got some individuals dying due to selection pressures, for example, lack of food, so they're outcompeted for resources. You could mention intra-specific competition in here as well, I suppose. Number 3, the individuals that are best adapted to their environment, they have an advantage, so they survive to reproduce, and that's called survival of the fittest. And then finally, the genes, which are the favourable alleles which gave the fittest individuals a selective advantage, they are passed on to their offspring. Okay. And that was our example there. So first stage, more offspring produced than the environment can sustain. Second stage, those less well adapted die. Those that are better adapted survive, and they pass on their genes to the next generation, and the process repeats itself. So let's just have a look through some various adaptations that organisms have. So I'll show you these, and you can have a think about why they might benefit the organism. So there's the first one. So cat and owls eat ducklings. So if the ducklings have this behaviour where basically they follow their mother, then that's going to lead to protection and less chance of them dying off. Whereas if some have a mutation which means they wander off, then the chances are they're going to, they might not survive. There is a cactus. Anyone know about cacti? So the the deal with these is they've basically got no leaves, and you'll remember from Unit 2 that transpiration occurs through leaves, so you have a lot of water loss. So what cacti have done is underground they've got deep roots and they can conserve water, but because they don't have leaves, that transpiration process is reduced, so they conserve more water. Prairie dogs hunted by hawks. So what they do is they kind of work together. They have good hearing, and while some of them are maybe foraging for food, the other one has got to look out. So this behaviour has evolved, and it means they're more likely to survive because they get a warning signal something's coming. And then finally, you've got kangaroo rats in hot, dry conditions. And what they do is they basically don't sweat. They produce very little urine and feces and so on, in order to, a bit like the cactus, reduce the amount of water lost. So here they are. So there's a desert rat in its hot, dry environment. Various adaptations, which again have just happened. It's not like the kangaroo rat has chosen to do it. It's just been a random mutation which has allowed it to survive. And over thousands of years, they've ended up with these characteristics. Cactus, as I said, so they've got no leaves to lose water, and they've got these large root systems to take in as much water as they can, whatever is available. And then the prairie dogs, so they give alarm calls, but also they've also learned this. So if they've got humans nearby, they came to realise that the humans didn't cause them any harm, so they didn't waste energy by all decanting into their burrows, so that saved energy. And ducks, so this is called imprinting. So after they hatch, the ducklings imprint onto the first large moving creature they see, which is usually their mother, although it could be a human, and that large object is going to feed and protect them, so they're more likely to survive. So this is interesting. Have a wee look at this. So YouTube film. So humans in 1,000 years, just to see how we might change over this period of time. And then it's time for a break. So for today, all I want you to do is watch this. So this is called Mankind Rising, and this basically takes you through human evolution. So it starts off with our ancestors, and we're in the oceans, and then at the time of the dinosaurs, our ancestors were little rodent-like creatures, and then finally we get to where we are just now. It's really interesting. So I would watch this. I think it's about 45 minutes. So that's your job for biology today. Watch this. So next session is looking at speciation. So another process related to natural selection, I suppose. So explain what speciation is and outline the stages. So speciation, the clue is in the word here. So as a definition, it is the process by which two or more new species are formed from one original. And just to talk you through this diagram, what you've got here is 5 primate species, including ourselves. MYA means million years ago, and what these little branches denote is where there was a common ancestor. So if you go back 5.5 million years, there was no humans, there was no chimpanzees, but what there was a creature which we evolved from and they evolved from. So this is called a last common ancestor. If you go back about 10 million years, then there was something which lived, and again a precursor of us and these other primates, and based on environmental conditions and natural selection, you had these 5 different species evolve from that common ancestor. So yeah, process in which 2 or more new species are formed from one original species. And again, this can be broken down into stages. So the first thing that happens is the species need to be separated. So this can be by various barriers, and one of them is called geographical. So I know it seems, how can they suddenly be separated by um, a mountain range? But we're talking about some species have been around for millions of years, and you will have potentially mountain ranges which do arise. Himalayas are relatively new in terms of mountains, I think. So you'll have mountain ranges which separate two populations. More commonly, it could be rivers. There was no channel between France and the UK not too long ago, so you can have a geographical barrier. The other one is ecological, so that's a different habitat within an area, and also behavioural is another potential barrier. But I guess the most common one, and the one we're going to use as an example here, is a geographical barrier. So we're starting off with these wee green folk, and they've been separated here. So the second stage, you might see what's happened here. You've still got these kind of original guys, but the second stage is mutations occur. So we now have mutants. So this one's got big ears, this one's got antenna, this guy's got kind of brown hair, and this one's gone blue. Okay, so mutations occur in the separated subpopulations. Then, as you might have guessed, natural selection occurs. So you produce more offspring, remember, than the environment can support, and there's selection pressures, there's competition for resources, and those that are best adapted pass on their genes. So in these circumstances, these ones over here, they've got brown hair, it's cold on this side, so their being hairy gives them an advantage. So you start to have more hairy folk on this side. On the other side, predation, the blue form has a selective advantage for whatever reason. They are less likely to be, maybe it'll scare their predators or whatever. They're more likely to survive, so they suddenly start taking over. They become the dominant, that allele becomes dominant, and you can see they're beginning to look different from the original species. So the individuals best adapted to the environment survive and pass on their genes. And finally, each subpopulation continues to evolve, and this is the kind of key bit, if you bring them back together, they can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Okay, and that is evidence that they are different species. So you might know, there's certain animals that you can breed together. You can put together a grizzly bear and a polar bear and get a pizzly bear and so on. There's different combinations. The tiger and the lion, you can produce a liger, but these ligers are sterile, and that's evidence that the tiger and lion are different species. Okay, so if they can't produce fertile offspring, you've got different species. And here it is all together. So there's the two populations separated. Mutations occur. You then have natural selection, and then you bring them back together, and they can't produce fertile offspring, so they are separate species now. So just another example, so you've got this population of Hawaiian honeycreepers, and you can see they're not too dissimilar, but then over time they have natural selections occurred based on the food that's available to them. They've got different foods, and they've changed so much genetically over periods of time that they can't interbreed anymore to produce fertile offspring. So here are the stages of speciation, and for this, it's up to you. You can write out the full thing if you want, or you could just put in the missing words, but yeah, these are mixed up. So I want you to put them in the correct order and write in the missing words, so press pause and do that. So what you should have had first was C. So two populations of one species, should be your first one, become separated by one of the following barriers: geographical, e.g. mountain; ecological, e.g. different habitat; and behavioural, e.g. different mating rituals. ritual. So C first, then it was D. Mutations occur in the separated subpopulations. Then A. Natural selection. Due to selection pressures in each subpopulation, the individuals best adapted to the environment survive and pass on their genes. And then finally, we're left with B. So each subpopulation continues to evolve. They are now no longer able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring, so are different species. That is our stages of speciation. And one of these to conclude, so this goes through natural selection and speciation. There's 12 mistakes, and I want you to identify them and write down the correct word. So press pause and do that. So here we go. Mutations are spontaneous, non-random changes to cellular material and are the only source of new bases. So that's wrong. That should be random. They're random changes. That should be genetic material and are the only source of new bases is not correct. So that should be alleles, new alleles. Factors such as radiation and pH can increase the rate of mutation. So that should be radiation and chemicals. So 4, just in those two sentences. The process of natural speciation, well, that's a mistake. That should be selection. The process of natural selection allows organisms to adapt to changing environmental conditions. First, mutations create variation in a population. Species produce many offspring, with some dying due to selection pressures, e.g. too much food, too little food, that should be. The individuals best adapted to their environment have a selective disadvantage, so that should be advantage, and survive to reproduce, and this is survival of the fittest. The favourable alleles which gave the fittest individuals a selective advantage passed on to their offspring, and so decrease in frequency in a population. That should be increase in frequency. So how many we had? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there should be 4 in here. So if you've not got 4, just pause and have a go and see if you can find the 4. So speciation, the formation of a new allele, well, that should be species, occurs when two populations of a species become separated by one of the following barriers: geological, careful, that should be geographical, e.g. mountain; biological, that's not right, that should be ecological, e.g. different habitats; or behavioural, e.g. physically unable to mate. Different mutations then occur in each subpopulation. Because of differing selection pressures, natural selection selects for different mutations in each group. Over time, each subpopulation evolves until they become so genetically different that they are two different populations. And that is wrong. So it's not different populations, it is a process of speciation, so it's two different species.